Good morning, everyone. We're back. This is the last section of this meeting. EU LAC relations certainty before the common global challenges. We are reflecting on the third summit EU LAC last year and the Spanish presidency of the European Union, where we talked about common challenges that were collected in the roadmap for peace and security, trade, digital transformation, investment agenda. The green transition, fight against climate change, justice, security for citizens, and governance models. And we have also analyzed another cooperation space, in this case, an Ibero-American cooperation space where Spain and Portugal meet the Ibero-American community. We've also touched upon many important issues that affect us all and that gave rise to several recommendations that will be collected and shared in the next meeting in Brussels. And now this is the third section, looking towards the future. We're thinking about the next summit, Latin American and the Caribbean and the European Union Summit that will take place in 2025 in Bogota, Colombia. Well, we will be analyzing the aspects derived from this debate, reflecting upon the results of the previous meeting. What will be the priorities for the future? The first panel of this third section is entitled Summit in 2025 in the current geopolitical context. The first speaker will be Juan Carlos Gaffo Acevedo, Ambassador of Spain and Deputy General Vice Director of Mexico, Central America and the Caribbean from the Secretariat of State for Ibero-American and the Caribbean and for Spanish in the world from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation. Please stick to your time so that the rest of speakers will have enough time. You have the floor, Ambassador. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction. I want to echo all the gratitude that has been expressed towards the government of Extremadura and the Yuste Foundation. It is a pleasure for me. This third section is looking towards the future. We are now abandoning the Latin American arena because we're talking now about a bidirectional flow. European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The Brussels summit was a success in all sides, in all aspects. Now we're looking at the summit in Bogota in the second half of the year to 2020. We're looking at the relations between the European Union and the Latin America and the Caribbean. We are in a changing and challenging context, and we need to insist on the complementarity and the need to cooperate. The affinity between the European Union and the Latin America and the Caribbean region, which doesn't mean that we're always on the same page. We cannot agree on anything, but it opens up new avenues for cooperation. I want to try and make a diagnosis on how we can work together, both Europeans and Latin Americans. And then herald some avenues for cooperation so that we can make sure that the Bogota summit will be a success. We are in a new geopolitical context. We have many different aspects, and there is a convergence of old and new issues that we have to tackle together. Otherwise, it won't be possible. So there are many uncertainties we have to face. And I have to warn you, we cannot be tempted to feel pessimistic because, for example, the Cuenca Summit didn't have a massive global participation of chiefs of state or government. We cannot let the differences in terms of ideologies or politics come before our shared interests, because we will be giving a very negative example to the international community, and especially because this is not real. As many people said before me, both in Latin America and Europe and the Caribbean, there is a massive groundwork, a massive work behind our backs. We have done many things and still many things to do, a long way ahead, but we cannot dismiss or ignore the work that has been done so far that many people unfortunately ignore. So what role do we want to play at this side and at the other side of the Atlantic? And what could we achieve if we were to join our forces even more? In the European Union, we believe we want to be a major player in this new context, and the Latin America and the Caribbean region is an essential and strategic player in the international community. In spite of the challenges I will be referring to, it is the region we share the most links with. Shared values such as democracy, peace, international security, the state of law, multilateralism, protection of the environment, etc. The European Union is the main investor and the third commercial partner of Latin America, only third to China, United States and China. So we have shared challenges, common challenges in the same geopolitical context. We have a worrying diagnosis, of course, but at least opens up a few unknown issues. For example, the lack of trust of the citizens. I'm not talking just about Latin America or the Caribbean. It's also happening in some European countries. In the United States, there is an increase in the security levels, low economic growth, human mobility in some cases unwilling. We have talked about massive migrations, which is a reality that touches Latin America and Europe and the world at large. In many cases, we are listening to we're hearing some populist discourses that create some security-based policies that jeopardize the respect of human rights. So this is a very complicated world in many different terms for security, for the economic world, and for human rights. In this geopolitical context, based on the agenda of the big powers, China, Russia, and the United Nations, can give us a competitive edge if we want to be optimistic. Of course, in the US, the arrival of Trump and Marco Rubio, let us think that faced with the uncertainty caused by the international and the US agenda, and faced with the Chinese agenda based on their national objectives, we need to understand that China is now becoming more strategic, is accelerating in this search for new raw materials. And Russia is now using the networks of misinformation that someone mentioned earlier, and is manipulating many of the realities in Latin America and the Caribbean. But faced with this reality, the European Union and the ALC region should choose together to become partners by choice. This is one of the results of the third summit EU ALC in Brussels, and also must be the motto for the Bogota summit. So faced with this polarization and fragmentation, which is not absolute or unchangeable, needs to be permanently revised, needs to be subject to our differences and controversies, but we need to keep on working on that. We may not let it eclipse what we have done so far. But it is true that sometimes it makes us question some consensus that were otherwise settled or consolidated. So this bi-regional association by choice needs to be strengthened by the common dialogue, high-level political dialogue. And the second level dialogue that has been mentioned, technical dialogue. We need to understand that Europe is seeing new changes in the new commission, a new high representative. We need to make sure that there will be a follow-up of the results of the Brussels meeting, that it won't be thrown away, because sometimes we haven't shown enough interest on this issues between the EU and the ALC. We must not ignore these questions anymore, because they are of the utmost importance for Brussels. We want to respect our differences. We want to modulate this dialogue. It can be, of course, constructive criticism sometimes in the way towards Bogota. We need to set up an agenda with topics that interest us all, both sides of the Atlantic. We need to listen to the priorities of the Latin American region, and we have to include them in our agenda, because the EU, sometimes only sees as priorities the European priorities and not the Latin American or the Caribbean priorities. We've talked about the regulation against deforestation that in some cases was perceived as an interference that affected the local producers, or the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions of the European Union that can be irritating for our bilateral relations. We have to choose to do so. We've talked about the global gateway. Yesterday, Ramon Jauregui accused us embassies or the European delegations of not being proactive enough to defend or to make those tools known. But we are nevertheless doing a very intensive work. There are many priorities we are working upon. We're listening to President Petro, the Colombian counterpart, about their priorities. Some of them are known. And I want to finish by saying that on the side of the European Union, we need to complete the amount of agreements in the region. And I am very happy about the agreement with Chile or Samoa in the Caribbean, and the agreement that entered into force on the 1st of May, the multi-party agreement with Colombia and Ecuador. But we have to make an agreement with Mexico and the Mercosur. And now the ball is on the Latin American side, because you have to work on your integration, your international integration. Polarization is a source of fragmentation. And if you stay on that path, you will be irrelevant and you will be losing the opportunity to sell your assets. But Europe has to go with you hand in hand. So we have to keep this agenda alive through a series of cooperation initiatives that need to be scheduled, specific. We need to jointly identify the priorities. We need to face our common problems with instruments that already exist, because we believe that our relationship is strategic. We need to tackle those problems together. We, of course, need to stay true to our constant, to our vitals, trade, democracy, human rights, peaceful, inclusive solutions for the different crises, both economic, political, and social in the region, and of course, international law. We have to preserve our milestones and our achievements and the boost we have given to these summits. And we are, of course, open to listening to our counterparts, the other part of the equation, Santiago. And of course, we want to stress that we will be making all efforts that we can devote to this objective with a common voice, a real voice. We need to speak up because we are representing many million people. We represent a union of interests, global interests that are in parallel with those values. And I'm sorry because I used a little bit more of my time. Thank you. Thank you, dear ambassador. Thank you for setting the context. Yesterday, we stressed the work performed by the Spanish presidency in the previous summit that unlocked good work after a silence of 8 years. You insisted on listening to the Latin American priorities to see how we can work together better. And now that we're talking about spaces and integration, the summit itself is a space for integration of both regions. So there is hope for that space to increase. Now we are listening to Colombia, the host of the next EU ALC or LAC EU summit, Santiago Mejia Hidárraga, the minister in charge of political affairs of the Colombian embassy in Spain. He will be talking about the priorities and objectives for the next summit. Thank you. Ambassador Avila wants to greet you. He couldn't be here today because he's in Valencia in another meeting, another event under the victims' law. Dear Elena Nevado, Juan Carlos Gaffo, and Yuste Foundation, thank you for having us here today. Well, I want to explain our view of the summit. We have 5 proposals, and I want to explain how we understand the summit mechanism, the value of the summits in this uncertainty context. We are looking for spaces for certainty. In the last summit, there was a context of the empire of multilateralism based on Bretton Woods, free trade in the markets in the context of climate change. But now the political changes in these spaces have changed and question the principles. So maybe we can create a new agreement if we are to keep the achievements that we have consolidated for the last 3 decades.
It risks to create many shifts, so we have two certainties here that we have to go over. Apparently, this could play against us. One is the certainty that cultural assets are turning an anchor because we can feel comfortable in a relationship that we believe is natural. And second, the certainty from the Latin American perspective of the huge impact of a great stakeholder, which is the United States in our policy. And then we have the certainty, lastly, from the Latin American perspective. This is something that our European partners have a hard time understanding. For us, overcoming poverty and the questions that we have on production mode are questions that are still to be answered uh, from Latin America. That's what accounts for such different governments like the ones that we have in Argentina and Colombia. These minimum agreements reaches a situation of crisis. In this context, the government of President Petro uh, is set the following objectives: achieve a right of the rule of law in agreement with the 2016 agreements and searching for peace, total peace. And I will explain this. For us, our foreign policy and the summit and the pro tempore presidency that we will have in next year and other activities are determined by the need, the pressing need to achieve total peace in Colombia. Equally, Petro's government has the objective of putting Colombia internationally as a country that promotes peaceful solution to controversies while proposing innovative solutions to the most vulnerable populations, the situation of drugs and climate crisis. This coincides with a situation in 2025 where we are going to face many opportunities. First, Colombia just hosted the successful 2016 COP on biodiversity in Cali, the result of which was the Declaration of Peace with Nature, which is an instrument to connect the relationship with climate change, and the next one in Brazil in 2025, focused on reducing emissions with the need to regenerate biotas for the capture of everything that has been emitted to the atmosphere. Understanding that Colombia is the most biodiverse country in the planet, currently, Colombia is chairing the Andean community in February 2025. We will have the pro-tempore presidency of the Pacific Alliance, and we will chair the next CARICOM summit in 2025, the Ministries Council of Caribbean States. Colombia also became the pro-tempore chair of the Consensus of Brasilia until December 31st 31st, 2024, and we will preside the CELAC European Union starting March 2025. This while the state of Colombia is going through deep transformations, um, wanting to comply what was included in the Peace Agreement 2026 expressed in the unilateral um, declaration presented in the United Nations, and it's committed to total peace. At the same time, we asked the international community to show solidarity, to understand that the position of Colombia in the face of these scenarios is connected to the resolution of the main internal situation that we understand as total peace, as an integral way to look for civilized ways to transform territories, stop violence, and territorialize peace. For this to be true, we need to strengthen institutional capacities and legal capacities. Total peace calls for an agrarian reform that would transform the territory and reflecting the real advance of less favored regions, and which is basic for peace and to avoid the problem from repeating. These are conditions to prevent violence and uh, sorry, the comment from the interpreter. The speed at which the speaker is reading is impossible for interpretation. From that perspective, we received a third summit, CELAC EU 2023, marked by the following circumstances. First, a summit with a strong presence of heads of states and government in the framework of the conflict with Ukraine. Latin American states were present, a strong leadership from Brussels to promote this bi-regional relationship, which may change as the composition of the European Union changes. In 2023, there was a hope in the face of the integration process between the EU and Europe. For example, the association agreement between EU and Central America, the associations with Mexico, Chile, and the one with the Mercosur. Fourth, common objectives are questioned due to changes in the context. In 2023, there was concern on the because of the war in Ukraine, as well as the long-lasting peace. One of the previous agreements was the lack of consensus in the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. In point 15, the need to respect sovereignty was shown. Nicaragua did not agree with this part of the statement, but today it is foreseeable to have a future negotiation in which Colombia is participating as co-participant with Turkey. In relation with one of the key aspects in the agenda, the agreement between the EU and Mercosur, we want to emphasize the position that the President Lula stated. The priority is to have a fair um, relationship based on common trust and not threats. In this final declaration, what is supported is the agreements like the ones with Mexico, etc., to be signed before the 2023 summit. France refused, so that treaty is blocked. There were renewed efforts to continue the dialogue with Haiti. Third summit, there was a dialogue started in Venezuela and Ciudad de Mexico that is an uncertain situation. There was a consensus on 2023 regarding the regulatories in the view of the blockade imposed in Cuba and the 2022 resolution expressing the need to stop the blockade. Today, this position could be changed by the changes in the United States. The United States took note of the attempt to solve the situation in Falkland Islands. Latin America requested restoring the wrongs of the slave past to try to heal our collective memory. The final statement backed the Durban Treaty, and CELAC through the CARICOM proposed a reparatory justice plan. The need to consider the asymmetries in the international financial structure was stated, and there's an interest to reinforce the cooperation between multilateral entities and and institutions and paying attention to vulnerable countries. In 2023, the stakeholders reinforced their commitment with the Paris Agreement on climate change and the commitment with renewable energies. These could be reviewed to achieve the goals in the light of the political changes in the US and the composition of the European Parliament. It seems like there's a consensus, and we're very proud about this, is the support to the peace process in Colombia. from Colombia's perspective, it is pressing to remind that on an international level, the European Union and SELAC should defend the sovereign equality of all states and territorial independence and political independence. Considering the strategic objectives is important. I think there's agreement, in fact, and I will give you an example of this. The importance of the European support in for the peace processes in Colombia. The European Union supported the peace process and has been doing so for the past 30 years. They supported the 2016 peace agreement and provided resources for the peace through the um, OPS development cooperation tools, among others. Equally, the EU is providing bilateral cooperation for the implementation of the 2016 agreement. It's part of the group of countries that is supporting the process. The EU delegation does not have a formal role in the social and legal conversations, but is actively present in the cities where those conversations take place through different alliances. A proof of this continuous support is that on April 18, the High Representatives for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, appointed Adrian Consent-Witter as the new envoy for the peace process in Colombia. There have been comments from the interpreter. The speed at which the panelist is speaking is impossible to follow. It's important to note the adoption of the Pact for the Future and the commitment with its implementation. The pillars are not in crisis but are being reviewed. This involves that rather than putting an emphasis on strategic situations, the European Union should recognize the position defended by the European Union comment from the interpreter, the speed at which the panelist is reading is impossible to follow. Thank you very much for your intervention. I would highlight in the beginning of it, when you mentioned the many fora in which Colombia is going to be present and is going to be a very important stakeholder internationally, and that may help look for synergies in the framework of the Latin America and EU synergies. You mentioned many presidencies. You mentioned the Andes community, the Conference of the Caribbean, and you mentioned very important topics. I want to emphasize two words that you mentioned repeatedly that I think are fundamental. One is peace. We believe that is one of the factors to take into consideration, particularly in this global context, not only in terms of the Latin America region and the priority of Colombia, but in the European environment. And above all, points of um, those points that are common in terms of strategic autonomy. This concept changed and it went from being something exclusive to being a more open concept in which Latin America is going to play an important role in terms of developing this strategic autonomy. And I am really sorry about the speed. It wasn't easy for the interpreters. I don't know up to what point they were able to synthesize. But for the future, for future interventions, please, you have to make an effort to speak slower because um, there are people who are not Spanish speaking, and in order to follow the presentations, the speed has to be adequate. I have the honor of introducing someone who's from the Yuste Foundation. Here we have the next speaker, who is Elena Nevado del Campo, the Vice President of Eurolat. She wasn't able to be here yesterday, and there has been she comes from a very intense meeting, and it seems like starting on the 1st, there will be a new structure, and she's here as the new Vice President of Eurolat, which is the um, parliamentary assembly that brings together the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean. So it is a great honor to have her here. She's from Extremadura. She's the vice president of Eurolat, and she's going to share with us the priorities that they have in this new European Parliament for relationships with Latin America. Elena, welcome. Thank you very much, Miguel Angel. It is a great honor. It is indeed my honor to be here. I want to start by thanking the Yuste Ibero-American Foundation for including members of parliament from the European Union in this very interesting debate. I wish to thank you for sitting me here with the ambassador and the delegate from the Colombia embassy because it's very rewarding to listen to them all and share um, their reflections and their conclusions. We don't have an executive power, but I think the framework of the European Union, the task that the parliament has and what they do through the CAM and Eurolat and other members of parliament, the other connections of members of parliaments and other institutions, is fundamental because measures are adopted in the parliaments. As we know, you are aware that these days we have been intensely uh, uh, devoted to having a government in the European Union. It was very tense, it was very complicated, and I want to apologize for not being here yesterday, but please understand that it was very hard for us to be here. Gabriel Matos was meant to be here. He's the president of Eurolat, and he is doing a great job for many years as the president of the institution. He can help implement all our measures and he can help create certainties in the face of these challenges ahead of us. He has been in the Cuenca summit. I want to emphasize that the fact that there have been um, people who were absent must make us reflect. Also, uh, in terms of considering what's going to happen in the next EU CELAC summit, the more the larger the number of heads of states is, the better we will be able to have an impact in this multipolar and diverse and challenging world. The presence of heads of state is key, and you must also work um, to this end, because it's heads of state who can really put into practice these very important agreements for both parts, for both sides. Challenges remain the same, in my view. Here, we have heard about the most important one, that is peace. But I think the relations between Latin America, Europe, and the Caribbean must keep being established. We have the challenge of concluding the fight against poverty. We have to work for sustainable development everywhere. Climate change is also a challenge, and we have to keep promoting those agreements that in the EU Select Summit 2023 were reached. An association, as defined by the European Union, is closed, stronger, and renewed between the two regions. That's what our relationship must be like. And despite of the change in the Commission, I think these objectives must remain unchanged. In Europe, unlike what happens in other member states, when there are changes in governments, associations sometimes change, and I think this won't be the case in terms of the objectives that we have for the summit next year. Caja Galas will be the person in charge of leading this process. And I wanted to share something because we were present in that meeting. The conclusions regarding Latin America were as follows. Relationships with Latin America and the Caribbean were going to be reinforced as much as possible. And she also mentioned during the meeting that other strategic alliances are also to be reinforced, like the ones with Africa or with the UK, who is not in the European anymore. So, regarding the situation, the geopolitical situation that we have, I can't hide that this week we had a specific uh, mm, plenary session where Zelensky was present after 1,000 days of war between Russia and Ukraine. And although this is a source of some tensions with our friends from Latin America, Brussels is still committed to being part of support to and the reparation and reconstruction of Ukraine, supporting the reform in the framework of its European trajectory. That was the commitment that the parliament unanimously and firmly um, um, transmitted to Ukraine. These conflicts that we are experiencing in Europe and in the world are what make our environment so volatile. We have two wars. We have the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. And this is something that we have to deal with when it comes to our relationships with China and the US that are focused on this. And China and the US are also involved um, in these conflicts, but their priorities are more domestic, and they have as a priority the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So we have a unique opportunity to reinforce our alliances. We have a situation, a context in which our two blocs must cooperate, and we have to position ourselves as stakeholders capable of leading our own destinies. We need to create this bi-regional alliance, one that is solid, for us to be able to um, have the possibility of taking shelter in the face of this uncertainty. We have this need to see our history and take it to the future, a future in which Europe, the European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean need to redefine their own progress. I'm not going to repeat what was said by the panelists before me. There's a proliferation of um, populist and extremist movements. But I want to say that in the face of this, most Latin American citizens and the youth in Latin America aspires to living in values, the values that are the basis of the European Union, the ones that we defend. We want citizens that want to build strategic relations that are stronger. And I think this must be a source for hope. José Borrell mentioned that we need to move from being natural partners to being uh, preferred partners. We're talking about over 1 billion people, and together we can have a global strategy, and that potential must not be underused. I also think that the European Union must go beyond. It must go beyond the climate cooperation, technological cooperation, digital cooperation, and social cooperation, and must focus on a clear purpose, which is to complete strategic bi-regional cooperation. And I'm really happy to hear that we share this view. We need to close these trade agreements that are still open, like the trade agreement with Mercosur. We need to support these initiatives, and we need to close these regional trade agreements and complete um, those agreements, because I believe that the summit in Brussels put over the table 130 programs, 45 billion euro, and we have to keep focusing on this gateway. So both Brussels and Latin America have the opportunity, and we can't be just viewers. We need to create a sustainable relationship in the Bogota summit. Thank you very much, Vice Presidents, for this presentation. And thanks for mentioning all those aspects that were addressed in the second summit. And these summits cannot be moved from one agenda to the next. These are global subjects that will be need to will need to be addressed constantly. And the presence of heads of states that you mentioned is of paramount importance. We need to face conflicts. And I want to emphasize something. You said that we need to be capable of leading our own destinies. And these summits gives us that opportunity to work together, to cooperate, to be able to face jointly those challenges. Agreements, without any doubt, um, is really important, and we will give the floor to um, other participants. Agreements are a fundamental topic. Yesterday, we heard some proposals in terms of agreements, and I am happy to hear that different stakeholders have that need to complete and close these agreements that have been worked on for so long and that are so important for this relationship and this integration. It is the time to hear some questions. We have 15 minutes for a discussion. So I want to invite all participants to um, pose their doubts.
I want to talk about 3 avenues that need more development. And thank you for the promotion. Then I would like to say that the multilateral furrow should be more structured. For example, European Union GRULAC, that's the name given by the United Nations, that are more occasional. But there are some political issues, especially those concerning crisis, that we might not agree upon, but in some others we do agree. So, for example, the Third Commission approved the resolution against the death penalty thanks to the initiative of Italy and Argentina. Even some Caribbean countries modified their position on this. And then I would like to talk about, well, there are some countries that have the dual citizenship. For example, Italy and Spain have several citizens with this dual nationality. And they can vote in their 2 countries. And this has to be taken into account by politicians. This would be interesting. Maybe we can take advantage of those dual communities. Thank you. Any remarks from the panel? Yes, thank you. I well, to the second and the third avenues that you mentioned, joint initiatives, of course. We have a roadmap agreed upon in Brussels that need to undergo joint negotiations so that we can set the priorities that we think we share on both sides of the Atlantic. And that roadmap has to be useful for us to set priorities. I didn't have the time to mention some of them that some other people have mentioned, for example, crime, fight against organized crime, transnational crime, drug trafficking. There are some programs, the bilateral cooperation between European Union and Latin America on drugs and against transnational crime. You know that Spain is organizing the 5th summit of the Coalition Against Organized Crime in 2025, and we have 3 main cooperation avenues: cooperation with the source and transit countries, the strengthening of the big hubs, airports, and harbors, and the dismantling of the big international networks. There is also a cooperation between Europol and Ameripol that is not negligible. We need cooperation in terms of justice, cooperation between the justice bodies. We haven't talked about migration in detail. There are 43 million Latin Americans that live outside of their countries of origin, 7 million of people from Venezuela, and similar figures for Nicaragua. This is a drama for some countries because some of them are countries of, there are transition countries or transit countries. For example, in the Darien Pass, they are subject to the criminal organizations and their human rights are violated. This is both of interest to us in Europe and you in Latin America. We've talked about digital alliance in Santiago de Chile. There have been the 4th high-level political dialogue that sets the joint priorities and the roadmap to jointly tackle everything around connectivity, artificial intelligence. You've talked about innovation, environmental challenges, preparation against disasters and risks in a especially vulnerable continent to floods, droughts, hurricanes, erosion, the increase of the sea level, deforestation. We have a memorandum of understanding for risk preparedness in after Barbados in May this year. Economic growth. We haven't insisted on access to international financial mechanisms. We are talking about middle income countries that can go to the debt markets, but the interest rates are excessively high for their perspectives and growth levels. We have to work together with the financial institutions to reach a consensus, for example, to implement some tools such as the green bonds so that they can use these funding mechanisms. In Sevilla next year, Spain will be the host of the fourth international conference. And then inequality and some other joint programs, debt swap, etc. Maybe we need someone to tell us their priorities. Colombia and the rest of Latin America could explain their priorities. I heard President Petro talk about drug production, uh, regional railways, green just transition, green transport, topics that interest us all, and we should jointly tackle them. Marco mentioned dual citizenship. Yes, in Spain we have a special interest in that. We have 4 million people coming from Latin America and many other Spaniards that share a dual citizenship with other, a dual nationality with other countries. There is a new law that opens the way to have a dual nationality with, for example, Argentina. We have over 500,000 people with that dual nationality. And that is, of course, important from a political point of view because for the elections and for many other considerations, economic, social, integration considerations, that is, of course, important. It is complex. We cannot just talk about it in fast, but we have many agreements of dual nationality that is beneficial for the citizens so that people in Latin America can have the Spanish nationality granted in a fast and effective way. Thank you. I'll leave it to you unless I don't know if other panelists want to talk about it. Parliamentarian diplomacy was one of the topics. Well, I just want to say that in Latin America, that has an increased difficulty because our system is not based on parliaments. We have a different conception, a different concept, a different notion. But I would like to focus on nationalities around the construction of a political subject. The political subject that is part of the de facto voters, which puts us on a regional conversation that is already taking place. In Colombia, we have many migrants abroad because of our inner conflicts. Many more than 6 million Colombians live abroad, 1 million in Spain. And out of that 1 million, Colombians living in Spain, more than 800,000, have the right to vote. But they insist on not just having the right to vote, they just want to express, they also want to express how they live and how they connect with their families, the families that have been left behind in Colombia, that they left in Colombia. And it all revolves around that family, those households between those who live in Spain and those who are still in Colombia. I have taken good note of this because I want to propose it in the Chancellor's meeting for the Colombia Summit in 2025. One of the difficulties we found was in talking to the non-Mediterranean European partners. Only after Brexit in Colombia, we saw the arrival of the Brits massively once they left the Union. And that conversation is very complex. The countries in Eastern and Northern Europe may have a say in these common topics. Yeah, I just want to use 1 minute. Diplomacy, parliamentarian diplomacy. It is a key within our targets. We want to strengthen democracies in Latin America. And the role of parliamentarians is, of course, critical. I also think that we need to promote and prioritize the countries that show a solid commitment with the state of law, good governance. And we need to find alliances to work together, not just by focusing on with which governments we want to work based on our political strategies. Now, I think this goes beyond because we're talking about strengthening peace and democracy in this context. And I think this is a key aspect. I think there were a few reactions when the ambassador mentioned, for example, access to financial mechanisms. Pablo Chiesa reacted to it. So I don't know if you want to say something about it. Yes, development banks have the opportunity to talk about this in Seville next year. This is a call for the Ministry of Spain. Even if this organization belongs to the United Nations, maybe you can create a specific space around that summit, specific for Latin America and the Caribbean and Colombia, with a special role because they will be hosting the summit. That will be essential in Seville. It would be essential to have that in Seville. Thank you for the proposal. We are well aware of the need for that specific space for Latin America. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the consensus. We will reinforce it in the conclusions in the report we're going to draft. And probably our next speaker will talk about that too. An applause. Thank you.